Roger conducts comparative research into peace processes, political violence, and local responses to international peace support interventions. I've got on my piece of paper here that I've emboldened the word local, because some of you might know that Roger is also an excellent blogger. And if you go to Roger's blog, he's got a really good post recently about doing some work and research on the notion of localism and the word local. What's really good about this blog, and I really suggest you go and have a look at it through the HCRI website, that's my plug, is that he decides to do some work and research on the notion of local in his local town. And he goes into his local town, and he goes into his local shopping centre, and he ends up going into his local. So please, I want to make you realise that when Roger talks about local, and if he mentions the word in his lecture tonight, he's talking about his local pub. So it's actually about drinking culture that Roger is going to talk to us about tonight. But besides his research, his field work in his local pub, Roger has conducted field work in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Georgia, Jordan, Kosovo, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, and the US. With his colleague and our colleague Oliver Richmond, he edits the journal Peacebuilding, and he edits a book series for Palgrave called Rethinking Political Violence. His latest books are International Peacebuilding and Local Resistance, Hybrid Forms of Peace in 2011, and also Routledge Handbook on Peacebuilding. I realised it said Local Resistance in the title of his previous book. That's obviously got something to do with his drinking habits as well, and he can tell you more about that. Roger's currently working on research of everyday peace indicators with colleagues at the University of Notre Dame and the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. I hope you enjoy this evening. There'll be opportunities to have questions with Roger afterwards. He's going to give a lecture that is going to last probably 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for a discussion. And of course, there's some drinks afterwards, which please, I hope you stay with us for. So I welcome Roger, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James. That's very generous of you. And thank you all for coming. Wednesday night has many attractions other than this. Coronation Street is on, and Manchester United are playing this evening. So thank you, and City. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to come along. Now, there's no handbook on how to give an inaugural lecture. There's no guide. And you can't ask anyone, because that would make you look stupid and not worthy of being a professor. So like any good academic, I Googled inaugural lecture. And I was able to find a 1905 book on inaugural lectures given at the Faculty of Arts and Theology at this university. And I thought, brilliant! This will contain everything that I need to know about inaugural lectures. So I got this electronic book, I opened it, and the lectures were shockingly dull, quite unbelievably dull. I can match that. Okay? I really can. And what I particularly liked about these inaugural lectures was that there were lots of complaints embedded in them about foreign competition in universities, about ideas and educational reforms thrust from above, about the dumbing down of education, all sounding horrendously familiar. And there was even a rant against the tyranny of lantern slides, which presumably were the precursor of PowerPoint. But what of the lectures themselves? What did they tell me in my quest to find out what you do in an inaugural lecture? Well, when I read them, I could see that these were statements of cutting-edge advances in intellectual journeys. They were made by leaders in the field who wanted to raise an intellectual flag. They were made by people who were recognized as being at the pinnacle of their career. and they used the inaugural lecture as a chance to explicate new ideas, new discoveries, new theories. Well, you can probably see my problem here, because I don't have any new theories, new ideas, new discoveries. I don't do the sort of work where on a Friday I can look back and think, well, actually I've discovered something this week. So in the absence of any startling scientific advances, I'm just going to talk about what I'm working on at the moment. But in a way, it's taken me a very long time to get to what I'm working on at the moment. It's been part of a very long intellectual journey that has brought me from orthodox approaches to studying peace to critical approaches to studying peace. It's brought me away from my comfort zone of international relations, which is what my PhD is in, into new disciplines for me. So social anthropology, social psychology, sociology, gender studies. It's brought me into increasingly conceptual and theoretical territory. And it's also brought me to parts of the world that I can say I'm truly privileged to be able to visit and privileged not to have to inhabit. So I'm reminded of just how privileged I am to be born and live in this hemisphere. And crucially, I couldn't have undertaken this journey without the assistance and encouragement of very many people, whether it was Mrs. Fox in Primary 1, who taught me how to hold a pen, or it was actually a pencil. They didn't let us near ink in those days. Or whether it's my current master's or PhD students who challenge me and my peers and colleagues. And there have been a lot of people in between Mrs. Fox in Primary 1 and my current PhD students. And I'm incredibly grateful for everything that I've learned from them, from parents, from siblings, many of whom are here this evening, teachers, peers, have all contributed to this intellectual journey. And I should also mention Mrs. McGinty, who cannot be here this evening, but every time I go to give a paper, she always says, remember, you're not funny and nobody likes you. So with that sort of encouragement, I stand in front of you with humility and with thanks. And I've benefited enormously, and I want to pay tribute to my colleagues at HCRI and at previous institutions. And I see that Cathy Gormley-Heenan, who works at the University of Ulster, is here, where I worked on my first job. And I see Stephanie Kapler is here, who was a fantastic PhD student at the University of York. University of St Andrews, sorry, yes. Okay, so over the next 3 hours, I want to argue that so-called ordinary people are actually quite extraordinary in how they navigate their way through life in deeply divided societies. Most attention goes to combatants. Most attention goes to men, often men with guns or men who shout loudly. And so-called irrelevant civilians are often left out of narratives. They're often regarded as being somehow irrelevant. Those are the people that I want to concentrate on this evening. And I want to say that these so-called ordinary people have quite amazing conflict calming potential, that they can stop societies tipping over from tension into all-out war. So I'm not interested in this. I'm not interested in men making peace deals in grand diplomatic capitals. I'm not interested in pieces of paper. Instead, I'm interested in the much more intimate level of peacemaking. Something that looks like this. We can see what's happening. The dog and the kitten are finding some sort of equilibrium. They probably don't trust each other. But they work out, okay, we have to share this space, a sofa, and we have to work out some sort of modus operandi to allow us to do so. So I want to talk about the routinized practices used by individuals and collectives as they navigate their way through life in deeply divided societies. I'm interested in why the city Tuzla in the former Yugoslavia was relatively calm in comparison with other cities in the same territory. Why are some Indian cities almost free of sectarian violence, whilst other nearby cities fall into bouts of sectarian looting and pogroms and rioting? What explains levels of intermarriage, interfaith and interethnic marriage in Lebanon or in the former Yugoslavia? So I'm interested in the coping mechanisms that people use to avoid contentious subjects, the constructive ambiguity that they use in their everyday life to conceal their true thoughts and their true identity. And I'm reminded of an incident that happened in my childhood. I grew up in Northern Ireland, where there was a small but very vicious civil war in the 1970s, 80s, early 90s. Now, in the 1970s, I remember one of my sisters, who's actually sitting here, brought me to the swimming pool. And while she went off and swam, me, a non-swimmer, played in the shallow end. And there was another young boy there, and I remember we played together. And at one stage, he asked me if I was a Catholic or a Protestant. And I told him, and we continued playing. And then it was time to go home. And on the walk home, I told my sister what had happened. And she was quite cross. And she told my mom. And an inquisition began at home. What did you say in answer to the question? Why did you say that? What religion was he? Who was the other boy? And I realized, age 6, that I had broken some rules in society. These rules were implicit and unwritten, but important. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in this set of unwritten rules. And what I want to do in this lecture is to conceptualize, situate, and typologize this everyday piece. And it's worth reminding ourselves of the power that individuals and small groups have to escalate and de-escalate conflict. Bailey, when talking about the former Yugoslavia, said, "I do not understand how good-natured neighbours could so quickly and so thoroughly be turned into demonized adversaries. How did the habitual tolerance of ethnic difference vanish so swiftly? And also, how do people stay out of that move towards genocide? How do they protect themselves and their families from it?" So that's what I want to concentrate on. I want to situate what I'm going to talk about within a field of critical approaches to peace studies. So I want to suggest that there's something quite subversive and critical about what I'm arguing. And I want to make 3 points here. The first is to remind ourselves that the study of politics and international relations is dominated by top-down approaches, by state-centric and institution-centric approaches. So to take the perspective that is bottom-up, from the boring civilians, from the unseen, is actually quite a critical approach to take to research. And interestingly, in the past 2 years, work by myself and my colleague Oliver Richmond has been heavily criticized in the journals by people saying, you really should pay attention to states, to geopolitics. It's almost like a Mackinder-ish approach from the late 19th century. So there is resistance to this idea that we should approach our subject from the bottom up. The second reason why I argue that this is quite critical is because it goes against the grain of how peace building is done. We're all familiar that the world has taken a technocratic turn. Anyone who is connected with this or any other university or public sector organization doesn't need to be told just how administrators run everything, how the spreadsheet runs how we manage our time, how we budget, how we engage in intellectual activity. More than that, technocracy is not neutral. Bureaucracy is actually deeply political, and it shapes how we approach day-to-day and indeed strategic tasks. And what we see through technocracy is power being given to those who have bureaucratic power. Power being given to the expert, so the person who can work spreadsheets, the person who can speak an English language, or the person who can fill out the EU grant form in a deeply divided society. And we see the reification of the expert, of the guru, of those who work the system. I want to argue that, yes, they're important. Technocracy, bureaucracy is important. I want my paycheck at the end of the month, and I'll be first in the queue if someone says the system is broken. But at the same time, we need to look beyond technocracy and see the power of individuals. The thing about technocracy is that it does not encourage creativity, innovation. It does not encourage alternatives. It encourages instead the replication of what went before rather than innovation and new ideas. So this everyday peace agenda is potentially critical and subversive in that it takes peace beyond the realm of the project, beyond the realm of the program, the funded initiative, the INGO. It takes us beyond the formal peace-building sphere to the kitchen, to the workplace, to the funeral, to the street, to the shop or the store along the street. So it's quite an unorthodox approach to study. And the third reason why I suggest that the everyday peace research agenda is somewhat subversive is that it allows us to question the fixity of boundaries, the fixity of actors, the homogeneity of categories. We're very used in our studies to see how they're organized around oppositional boundaries, oppositional binaries. So the study of peace and conflict is often organized in terms of pro-Assad, anti-Assad, Hutu, Tutsi, good, bad, modern, traditional. These binaries are actually quite useful for us in helping us to understand the cosmology of peace and conflict, but at the same time there's something of an intellectual conceit. And I'm sort of tired of opening textbooks and seeing typologies, very neat organograms in which the knee bone is connected to the leg bone, or the minister is connected to the special advisor who's connected to the permanent secretary who's connected to the undersecretary. And in a way, it's a bit of a social scientific conceit that we've convinced ourselves that we can tame and understand the social world. We can to a certain extent, but when I see an organogram that is overly neat and stylized, I think Jackson Pollock. I think real life is a bit more like that. It's messy. Probably 95% of us really think that's not art. It's just a mess. And in many ways, the societies that we're thinking about, and indeed our own society, have an element of anarchy, have an element of free thinking and free movement that tends to be squeezed by a lot of orthodox social science that tries to capture it in overly neat ways. Okay, so let me move to conceptualize what I mean by this thing called everyday peace. And to do that, I want to make three assumptions, or share three assumptions with you. The first is that I assume fluidity in terms of the social world. We're all aware of the narratives from conflict zones which say that the conflict and the situation is unchanging. We've all seen the news reports from the Middle East in which the television footage moves from now into black and white. And it says that the conflict that's going on in 2013 is the same that was going on in 1953, 1903, etc., etc. That these societies are stuck and the people within them are stuck. Instead, I want to point to the malleability of individuals, of collectives, of ideas and practices. We can think of everyday peace as being fluid, as being very much dependent on context, possible sometimes, impossible at other times. A second assumption is that I don't buy into this notion of the homogeneity of groups. Clearly, we are used to hearing, particularly news reportage, which breaks societies down into very simplistic dyads or groups. So the reports on Syria at the minute, pro-Assad, anti-Assad. I suspect there's a lot of people in Syria, if they have the luxury of choice, who are waiting to see which way the wind blows. And they'll go that way, because that's rational. So depending on who they're talking to, and if they've got the choice, they will be pro that person. So I want to move away from this notion of blocks that are fixed, that there are not outliers in blocks, that there are not those who go against the grain, that go against the hegemonic narrative that the communal leaders would want to perpetuate. And the third assumption is that locality matters. What I'm talking about is the local, not the local as in the licensed local, although it could include that, but locality really does matter. So one valley in Afghanistan might hear the sound of explosions, and the next valley actually might be fairly peaceful. One village might, or one housing project or housing estate might have reached some form of equilibrium, whilst another one has episodes of turmoil or ethnic cleansing. So local context matters. Social entrepreneurs matter. People make a difference. The people who bring others together, who put their head above the parapet. And those people sometimes can be benign and work for good, and sometimes they can be ethnic entrepreneurs. They work for division, they work towards their own aggrandizement. So locality really does matter in this. I'm talking about micro or nano areas, streets, neighbours, villages, hamlets. Then, to define what I mean by everyday peace, well, for me it refers to the practices and norms deployed by individuals and groups in deeply divided societies to avoid and minimize conflict and awkward situations at the inter- and intra-group level. Now, we all engage in this everyday diplomacy, even if we're in a deeply divided society or not. I mean, a university campus is fantastic for it, for observing it. You see someone on the other side of the quad and you think, that is a world-class Olympic bore, and you change your course to avoid them. Or you owe them something. You know, you've missed a deadline and you owe them a piece of paper, so you avoid them. So we all do this in everyday life, but it becomes more acute in deeply divided societies because the risks are so much greater. One could get into serious trouble. So everyday peace can be important. It can prevent societies from tipping over the edge into all-out conflict. It operates at the intergroup level and the intra-group level. Often it happens in marginal spaces, in unthreatening spaces. There's some really good ethnographic work that looks at a deeply divided city in which people from different ethnic groups come together, mothers, in a creche. And they describe themselves in the interviews as being day friends. So they can come together during the day, but they wouldn't dream of socializing with each other at night. As one of the interviewees says, we're mommy friends. And in a sense, motherhood or early motherhood gives them a little bit of insulation, a little bit of protection. And reflecting the lack of a rule book, it's important to say that everyday peace is not formally taught. Instead, it relies on sensitive perception and intuitive responses. It relies on parental guidance, observation, trial and error. I made the mistake in the swimming pool as a 6-year-old. Probably didn't make it again, or I hope I didn't make it again. And common sense is a principal transmission mode. So the rules are implicit. They're embedded within and between communities, but they're rarely explicated. You won't find them written down. And this absence of a rule book actually infuriates policymakers. So when I've been talking about this to people who work for development and peacebuilding organizations, they say, well, how can we use this? How can we instrumentalize this? How can we tap into this? And my answer disappoints them and says, you can't, because you're not part of the gang. You don't have the authenticity. And the moment that you try to mess with it, you mess it up. You gild the lily. And everyday peace is dialogic in the sense that it relies on interaction. It relies on social recognition, social responses. It relies on reciprocal interchange, an unspoken pact whereby actors agree to follow the same ground rules. It is at once ad hoc and improvised. It's ad hoc in the sense, it's at once ad hoc and scripted. It's ad hoc in the way that we can have some form of improvisation. We can mess about a little with the parameters, but it's also scripted in that we follow particular tropes. We follow a script, a non-contentious conversation. So we talk about the weather rather than the elephant in the room. So I want to get away from this notion that people in deeply divided societies are followers, that they're sheep, that they're easily manipulated, that in a sense they're just pawns in the hand of a political leader who gives them the script and they follow it. Instead, what I'm talking about is actually a really high level of emotional intelligence in which people can pick up on multiple signals. They can change their stance and behavior. They calibrate their response according to the particular audience. And of course, practices of everyday peace can become targets as well. If too prominent or widespread, everyday peace might threaten combatants. it might threaten those political leaders who profit from division. So let me move on and in a very rudimentary way, typologize what I mean by everyday peace. And a principal division runs through this typology in that both these, all 5 forms of everyday peace can operate at the intragroup and the intergroup level. So they happen within our own communities and between communities. And I think that the most important one is avoidance, is keeping your head down, avoiding nutters, basically, who will get you into trouble, avoiding contentious pubs on a Friday night, avoiding places that you will get into trouble. There's also ambiguity, in which we tend not to give a full account of ourselves. We might adopt, in certain circumstances, very plain signals, plain dress, plain expressions. We might try not to give too much away about ourselves. We might adopt a different name for ourselves rather than give a name that is a signifier of ethnic or religious identity. A third part of the typology is ritualized politeness. So a system of manners comes into play, in which people are overly polite with one another rather than risk some form of escalation. So they just, talk about the weather, ask about children, incredibly polite. We engage in what social psychologists call telling, which actually is a form of intelligence gathering, in which we use social categorization and social identity to work out who the other person is, and more importantly, what they are. Are they one of us? Are they one of them? Can I trust them? Are they dangerous to me? Do they know people that could be dangerous to me? So we engage in this constant bout of emotional intelligence. And then finally, we've got blame deferral, which is finds itself or expresses itself through us blaming extremists within our own camp for the trouble. It's not me, it's the guys down the road. If only they'd just get a bit of maturity. Of course, I don't share their opinions. I'm different, or they're different from me. So these 5 activities come together to produce a complex system of interaction aimed at survival and risk minimization. And it allows 2 processes to happen simultaneously. First, it renders habituation in a sectarian environment tolerable. You can survive it if you follow the rules and if everybody else follows the rules. Secondly, it's a form of bounded civility, with the boundaries amounting to an acceptance of some form of conflict, but restrained conflict. So it's a negative peace rather than a positive peace. And in trying to think about what this everyday peace looks like, I came across a poem. Now, at this stage, your blood sugar level is running low. Your heart has just sunk several inches because McGinty has mentioned poetry. Rest assured, I am not going to read out a poem. But in 1976, this man, Seamus Heaney, a Nobel Prize-winning poet from Northern Ireland, published a fantastic poem called Whatever You Say, Say Nothing. Now, when at the time Heaney was writing, about 300 to 400 people were dying in Northern Ireland every year. About 50% of them were civilians. You really needed to adopt a survival mechanism to protect you and your family. And Heaney's poem, Whatever You Say, Say Nothing, contains some fantastic lines which encapsulate what this everyday peace looks like. And he's talking about the society that he's coming from. But every society, whether it's Kenya or Liberia or Rwanda, will have their own script. So Heaney's script involves these magnificent lines. He talks about expertly civil-tongued neighbours. So it's about restraint. Sucking the fake taste, the stony flavours of those sanctioned old elaborate retorts. So he's talking about the script that we use. Talk about the weather rather than the murder down the road. Religion's never mentioned here, of course. But of course you know them by their eyes and hold your tongue. So you don't talk about religion, but you think about religious identification all of the time. He talks about the tight gag of place, about saving face, about whatever you say nothing. He says smoke signals are loud-mouthed compared with us. So you can talk and talk, but you don't actually say anything. He talks of land of password, hand grip, wink and nod, of open minds as open as a trap, where tongues lie coiled. So he's bringing us or making us think about the serpent or the snake and the deceit that is involved. So every society will have its own script, its own Heaney-esque account of what everyday peace looks like. Okay, so I've explained what I think everyday peace is, but there are very many limitations to this. There are many criticisms. And the principal criticism is that it is a very limited form of peace. It's conflict management rather than conflict transformation. It's negative peace rather than positive peace. It accepts conflict. It tolerates prejudice. To some extent, I think this criticism is true. Well, it is true. But I think it's unfair, because it could be that everyday peace is all that is possible. It could be that to engage, even in very small steps of everyday peace, involves personal bravery, involves risk. It could be that the circumstances just allow this and nothing more. A second criticism is that everyday peace operates within a wider system of power. So critics could say, well, what's the point of Israelis and Palestinians getting on and being civil to each other if Israelis hold most of the cards? If the power dynamic is that Israel is much more powerful than many Arabs and Palestinians. They say that everyday peace is froth and tinsel. It's sort of polishing the edges of what really is a nasty picture. And that is true. Although I am talking about highly localized islands of civility that can have an impact on how people lead their lives, can have an impact on the development of children, the development of businesses in localities. So this can actually be quite important. A third criticism that is made of everyday peace is that it is insincere. It's a mere front that we use in our day-to-day relations, but it doesn't have any substance, that it's about the world of ceremony. The charge is that everyday peace is a form of dissembling, where individuals say one thing, but they mean something else. Yet all individuals dissemble. We all do it all of the time. We all say something, but mean something else. Isn't that wonderful that human beings can do that? I mean, if we couldn't do that, there would be brawls everywhere. If we didn't get out of the way on the pavement and say sorry when the huge rugby player is walking down the pavement towards us, we'd be flattened. And he'd probably come and reverse over us. So we don't really mean sorry when we say sorry, but it's a piece of social lubricant. It gets us out of difficulty. So this dissembling, I would suggest, is actually very important. It's rational. And we can adopt a moral position and say that's lying. But if it's lying, it's actually socially sanctioned lying. If it's being two-faced, we're both in on the bargain. In a sense, it's us facing two ways without being two-faced. So I don't think that it is actually morally wrong. I think it is an artifice that we're all aware of and that we use. And the fourth criticism that is made of everyday peace is that it is so context-dependent that this cannot work in societies where people from different groups don't have contact with each other. That's true. I mean, this is the Israeli separation barrier, which is deliberately built to keep Israelis and Palestinians apart. Now, one explanation is that it is there to protect Israelis from suicide bombing. Another explanation is it is there to keep the sides apart so they can demonize each other, so that they can other the other. They can invent and perpetuate stories about the other. So my notion of everyday peace doesn't work in somewhere like Georgia and South Ossetia, where there are physical barriers between people, or Israel-Palestine, where Israel has built this physical separation wall between communities. Instead, I'm talking about societies where people live cheek by jowl, where they can have access to each other. I'm talking about places like the former Yugoslavia, or parts of it, or parts of Kosovo, or parts of Northern Ireland or Lebanon. In March this year, I went to the divided city of Mitrovica in Kosovo. It's divided by a river, and the bridge over the river is blocked just by some rubble. But it's very clear you're not welcome to cross it. You can't bring a vehicle across it. And on the Serb side, on the north side of the bridge, there are what are known as bridge watchers. And these are simply men in leather jackets who hang about. They don't do anything. They don't say anything. They don't ask you questions. But it's very clear that they are there and they're watching you and they are discouraging movement across the bridges. So many people in conflict areas actively engage in boundary maintenance, and I'm aware of that. So I'm talking about places where these boundaries have slipped away. So you'll be delighted to know I'm reaching a conclusion, and even more delighted to know that university wine is probably, I was going to say being uncorked, but let's face it, unscrewed. This is the public sector. So to conclude, I want to suggest that everyday peace is something more than highly localized coping mechanisms. These coping mechanisms are important in a local context. They can and they do save and improve lives. But I think that everyday peace has a wider formative role in deeply divided societies. It does prevent them from tipping over the edge. It can provide elements of civility and stability that are needed in societies undergoing conflict and dislocation. My colleague Oliver Richmond calls this peace formation. And I think everyday peace, what I've been talking about, this everyday diplomacy, is part of this peace formation. It is a system of micro-solidarities in which individuals and groups develop cooperation and accommodation. And some of these activities might be deliberately aimed at lessening tension. They might be deliberately aimed at addressing the conflict. But a lot of them aren't. They're actually about common problems, access to transport in rural areas, access to resources, access to markets, access to public goods. And if we see local initiatives and processes in totality rather than just isolated, then they suggest a level of societal organisation that is often missed in standard accounts of conflict communities. It confronts the hegemonic narrative of the binary, that there are just two groups, the pro and anti-Assad, the Hutu and the Tutsi. Peace activists and their Tutsi, I'm aware that I called the Tutsis Tutus earlier on, I've just realised. So peace activists often are pigeonholed. They're often caricatured as open-toed sandal wearing, muesli eating, lentil scoffing, tree hugging, flower in the hair wearing wasters, idealists. I'm not talking about that community, although I respect that community. I'm actually talking about the moms and dads, the kids, the workers, the employers in deeply divided societies who are making hard-nosed decisions that aren't based on doves and tree hugging, that are actually based on survival. They're based on rational decisions about how can I protect my family and maximize the choices open to my community. So it's easy to write peace activism off as being inconsequential, but I want to suggest that actually it contributes to the social glue that holds many societies together, that explains why not every deeply divided society becomes a Rwanda. Remember, there are about 5,000 groups that claim to be ethnically distinct on this planet. There's nothing close to 5,000 violent conflicts. So us human beings are doing something pretty well. We're doing something right. But I suggest that we're actually pretty bad at telling that good story. So I want to finish simply by saying that I think everyday peace is actually quite important. And oddly, much orthodox social science has overlooked it and dismissed it as being unimportant, and that the real business of peace is those men in suits signing documents. That's part of it, but I think that it's only part of it. So thank you very much.